Finish it out. I could do one more deck, but those two are pretty good. It's kind of a random book.
A girl, or a boy, or a beast. Lucky animals can't breed with humans. A strange, bitter smile flickered over her lips. Now, my friend, she continued recklessly, you know what you've saved. You've heard what they called me. Menagerie Sal. Literally, my hair did stand on end. At least, I felt a cold contraction of the scalp, and my sight vacillated. This is too horrible. How could you? Why did you stand it? I liked it. What? I don't want you to take home any illusions about a repentant sinner, and I've paid for it. My God, I have paid for it. When my money was gone, I had quite a good deal, and it lasted a longish time. I sank if one could sink below that, but one is always comparatively up when one can pay. I sank lower and lower. The most vicious of scum knew of me all over the world, and came to me like filings to a magnet. It was too late to get away. I was Menagerie Sal, the darling of the beasts, human and otherwise. And that's where I am now. I told you the truth just now when I said that no self-respecting whore would be seen speaking to me. And if any clean white man showed any signs of wanting me, they are all round me and on to him at once, telling him things mostly true. And what's more, none of them would go with a man if they knew he'd been with me. You know, there are grades of respectability, even among harlots. I'm afraid I'm shockingly mal vu in the oldest profession in the world, even as practiced in Rathcliffe Highway. It is not often that I have enough to eat. I shouldn't be allowed in here if you hadn't brought me. Now you know why I'm going to kill myself. If I don't, one of the brutes will kill me some day. See this scar? And she pulled her blouse away upon her shoulder. That was done by a sort of gorilla. I was trying to get away from him. So, I'm going to out it. Don't you think I'm right? I could not answer. I was paralyzed with horror, especially by the calm manner with which she spoke of these unspeakable atrocities. I harked back and repeated in an undertone, "You like it?" "Yes, sometimes. That's the truth. But I'm afraid of the end of it. Afraid." And she covered her face with her hands and shuddered. I sat looking at her, at last, as though she were a curious pathological case in a mental hospital. And then a horrible but irresistible thought came to my mind. The cheetah. I began, my heart beating violently, to feel my way. "What a life," I said. "But I confess you interest me dreadfully." "Do I?" she said, suddenly looking up. "Aren't you disgusted?" Then she gave a short laugh and said, "I wonder. Well, I expect you'd be as bad as any of them if you had a chance, if the truth were only known." "And suppose I were?" "Oh, I shouldn't mind. I've been through too much. But I am surprised, you with your solemn, learned old air." I thought rapidly, and then, to my eternal misery, I made up my mind. Such a chance could never occur again. I said, "Supposing I were a worn-out old rake with unnameable curiosities, jaded with all ordinary vices, and supposing I said to you, 'Come away from here, come and live in the country. I will settle a sum of money upon you which will keep you from want in the event of my death. I am a scientist, a vicious one if you like. I should want to try all kinds of experiments on you. What would you say?' I'd say, as the Yanks do, 'Put her there, governor.' You can't do anything worse to me than I've had done to me already, and I'd love to be away from all this mob. When do we start?" We talked on for half an hour, and then I left her. She gave me an address to write to, at a poste restante. A month later, she was installed in a cottage in the village where I then had my research laboratory. She had no desire to mix with the people of the place, but for the information of the public and the parson, she gave herself out to be a young widow. The name she adopted was Mrs. Clayton. Of course, it was immediately observed that she had come there at my instigation, and that when I was at the laboratory, she was constantly at my house. They drew their own, the inevitable, conclusions, but as I had steadily repelled any attempt on the part of the Aborigines to establish social relations with me of any kind, this did not trouble us. Ursula Clayton left behind her in the parlous of the docks every trace of her professional career, accent, vocabulary, and manner. When my solicitor, who with my assistant Rex Magley will be trustee of my will, had proved to her that a certain income was settled upon her in any event, she abandoned all reserve. Hitherto our relations had been a trifle strained. She seemed unable to realize that I was determined to act in her permanent interest, and was not merely amusing myself for a short time. She became a really delightful companion. I was a bachelor and never at any time an anchorite, and the society of Ursula Clayton was interesting and satisfying in every respect. I gradually came to know her history, which, though it does not concern this narrative, is illuminating as an explanation of her abnormal sexuality. In the 80s of the last century, there are still people old enough to remember a hot wave of what are known as unnatural vices, almost openly and unblushingly practiced, swept over our English society. It was the outcome of the aesthetic craze intimately associated with the name of Oscar Wilde, who ultimately in the 90s paid for everyone and subsequently died overwhelmed with public envy and the private admiration of the few. It became a matter of ordinary conversation to discuss homosexual love affairs of men and women prominent in society, especially of the latter. In a word, sodomy and lesbianism were, sub rosa, fashionable. Preeminent among the male perverts was a well-known peer of artistic taste and enormous wealth, at whose house in the country homosexualists of both sexes congregated, and where, as was affair, orgies took place that were spoken about with bated breath in the most fashionable boudoirs. Prominent in this society was a very high-born dame indeed, in whose hands or arms no woman was safe, and she formed the center of a lesbian coterie, which spread like a rodent ulcer into almost every class of society.
I see you.
It was in the unnatural order of things that the masculinity of the lady and the femininity of the Lord X should bring them closely together.
Oh, dude.
So closely indeed that, to the astonishment of the inverted world, Lady Z gave birth to a child who was christened Ursula. This child was sent abroad to be brought up in Italy. A respectable sum of money was settled for her maintenance and education, which became hers absolutely on attaining her majority. With such a heredity, it is not surprising that Ursula developed early a sexual precocity, desinvolture, which the settlement made upon her by her parents enabled her to gratify to the fullest extent of her inclination. She told me her early sexual history, which was amazing, but does not concern us, beyond what she told me in Ratcliffe Highway, and which I have already recorded. By the time she came to our village, her fires were burning low, her sexuality was to a great extent satiated, and she showed no trace in her manner or proclivities of the storms which had disturbed her youth. She was a charming companion, an intelligent and well-educated friend, and a charming mistress.
I'm going to play ball if we don't have numbers.
And the cheetah? We called him Kumar. He settled down in our two houses as a great affectionate domestic pet. Sometimes, in passage between the two, led on a chain by Ursula, he terrified the inhabitants of the village, human and animal. But this was very seldom, as the villagers had grown accustomed to what was known as the Professor's Zoo. The attachment between Kumar and Ursula became very close, and indeed I sometimes feared a precipitation of events. But Ursula was too keenly interested in my work to endanger the results by premature action. I conducted my experiment on the lines suggested by Milne Edwards. There was nothing to inoculate Kumar under a local anesthetic. He would never have dreamed of the possibility of being hurt by either of us.
I do.
The day arrived when the blood tests were wholly satisfactory. The serum of the one accommodated the corpuscles of the other without any trace of hemolysis. And I left the rest to Ursula. I do not know what I expected to be the outcome of this experiment. It was impossible to anticipate. As a practicing surgeon, I was skilled in obstetrics and had no fear for the result, only an intense curiosity. If I expected anything, it was a queer little monster, which I should allow to live long enough to be perfectly formed and then prepare as a specimen, explaining its presence as an arrival from a native collector in India. At the end of only 6 months' anticipation, Ursula gave birth to one of the most perfectly formed little female children it has ever been my lot to look upon. She was remarkably furry, but newborn babies are often thus, and as in the case of this child, they lose it in a month or two. I should mention, though it is not material, that I took a house on the south coast for Ursula to await the event. I delivered her myself, and she brought the child whom we had registered as of illegitimate birth under another name and had baptized Unica, the only apposite name, it seemed to me, back to our village. There could not be any question of destroying so perfect a little specimen of humanity, and when Ursula returned with her, she explained her, when necessary, as a foundling she had adopted from a workhouse on her travels. I will not try to set down here what were my thoughts as I read this frightful record. They are indescribable. It was all I could do to prevent myself burning the manuscript and taking 5 grains of morphine on the spot. But I dared not do it. I had to read on, though it was now broad daylight. The child grew in beauty and charm, developing with a rapidity which amazed me. When she was 2 years old, Ursula Clayton left her cottage and came to live in the house near Cosmopoli where she now inhabits. After the birth of Unica, I ceased my physiological experiments in this direction. I had been too successful, and dispersed my collection of animals. I was frankly terrified, and still am, at the success of my culminating effort. Unica is entirely human physically, but I constantly recognize the feline influence in little actions, tastes, in her whole mentality. What will happen when she grows up? When her sexual life begins? When puberty asserts itself? I tremble to think. One thing is abundantly manifest. She must never be allowed to marry. What response would she make to the Mendelian law? Her children? Would they be children? The thought turns me cold. The one thing I can think of is that as soon as she reaches puberty, she must be drastically operated upon. Ovariotomy, hysterectomy, the whole thing. But how explain the necessity? Would any surgeon in the world consent to spay, to sterilize a perfectly healthy, apparently normal and beautiful young girl? I doubt it very much. There is only one course to be pursued, but it is one which will shatter and ruin my life and Ursula's. So long as we two, and we alone, know the awful secret of Unica's birth, our minds may remain easy, and we can face the world with nothing more against us than the tittle-tattle of our neighbors, who may look upon Ursula as the faithful mistress of a faithful bachelor professor. Indeed, I often regret that I did not marry Ursula before I brought her to Cosmopoli. I should then have been able to keep closer watch over Unica and carry out myself what I now set down. If any man ever desires to marry Unica, he must be told the whole truth. It will be a frightful thing to do, and it might have to be done over and over again. It would end by all coming out. But if, in spite of this stunning revelation, any man is bold enough to persist in his desire to marry her, he must be warned to take every possible and known precaution against having children by her. I may die before this happens, and then, God help her, this awful duty will devolve upon Ursula Clayton. It is with this in view that I have written out this manuscript, in all its revoking details, concealing nothing, glossing over nothing. Ursula shall do all she can to discourage suitors, but should one present himself persistently, he must be told. I have told him. Paul Barrowdale, August 19 blank. Following upon this apparent termination of his manuscript came another entry dated 10 years later. I reopened this record, which I ardently hoped I should never peruse again, but it is imperatively necessary. At the age of 11, Unica has passed the arrival of puberty and is a fully developed and very beautiful girl, having passed through a stage in which, though beautifully formed, she was a sallow, swarthy, repellent little girl. Her whole body is classically perfect, and as far as showing it to her mother and me is concerned, quite unashamed of her perfect nakedness. She is covered with the light peach-bloom down, which makes many fair women so intensely attractive, but the down is a light tawny orange color, recalling the coat of poor Kumar, who died by my hand deeply as I regretted the necessity after her birth. The down is punctuated here and there at more or less regular intervals by small imperfect rings of a darker color, that of her normal hair, though not so dark, which to our instructed eyes recall vividly the markings of Kumar's coat. The only idiosyncrasy which she exhibits beyond this is the extraordinary luxuriance of her auxiliary and pubic hair, which is beautifully grown but phenomenal in such a young girl. She has another peculiarity which one cannot but recognize as hereditary. If she is unhappy, which is rare, or annoyed, which is rarer still, or if she is afflicted with any passing fit of childish naughtiness, all that is necessary is to insinuate our fingers into the thick curls under her arms and tickle and caress her like an animal. her mood becomes serene at once. I hate to use the word, knowing what we do, but she positively purrs with contentment, and if the caress is gently prolonged, she goes fast asleep. The primary object of this postscriptum is, however, to call attention to what is really a very serious matter. It is that at her times of periodic disturbance, which take place not monthly but at intervals of 3 to 4 months, she is subject to what may rightly be called oestrum, a frenzy of sexual desire. Though she is technically quite ignorant of sexual matters, it appears in many ways her beauty is greatly enhanced. Her eyes become even finer than usual, her lips more crimson, and her nipples are in a constant state of erection and intense sensitiveness. She is restless and unsatisfied and wants to go out and mix with people for no reason that she is aware of. As a rule, she is self-contained and utterly indifferent to companionship, even to that of her mother. At these times, which are remarkably prolonged, often to a fortnight or 3 weeks, she must be very carefully watched. Above all things, she must not be allowed to get into contact with men. I am convinced, poor child, that it would be disastrous to her, and the terrible results I've hinted at in the record would almost certainly ensue. Ursula Clayton's alive to this, and I can rely upon her never to leave her alone in these circumstances. Her husband, should she ever have one, must also be warned of this danger. I have warned him. Paul Barrowdale, May 19 blank. It is as impossible for you who read this to imagine as it is for me to describe what I felt when I at last terminated the perusal of Barrowdale's manuscript. One amazing fact, one concerning which I had curiously enough evinced no curiosity, was that of her age. Comparing the dates of Barrowdale's record and its postscript, it became clear Unica was only 13 years old. It was broad day when I went up to our bedroom. Unica had not moved. She lay with her head resting on her right arm, which had drawn her nightdress free of her right breast, which stood up, inviting caress. I put my lips to it and closed them in a long kiss. The delicate, intoxicating perfume which I now could explain struck me more persistently than usual. Under my caress, she awoke for a moment and said, "Oh, you darling, then it wasn't a dream. Go on," and so fell asleep in my arms as she rolled over onto me and slept until the servant brought our morning tea. After breakfast, I told her I had worked until morning and must go for a long walk to get the cobwebs out of my head. She said, "All right, so long as you don't ask me to go with you. I shall curl up on the divan and think about my baby." I went out. Her baby. What would it be? Barrowdale and I had carried out a long series of Mendelian experiments. I could not blind myself to the probability, the inheritance of characteristics transmitted through the female line, that she would throw back. I shuddered at the thought. It was practically a certainty, a foregone conclusion. There was nothing else for it. Abortion is a hideous word, but this child must not be born. It must be got rid of at once. She was almost 2 months pregnant already. I shuddered at the thought of what even a miscarriage might bring to light. I knew that I had a terrible task before me, but I had to face it. How terrible it was, I fortunately could not foresee, or what an effect my decision was to have upon both of us. I tried to prepare the way by calling upon the doctor whom I had had in mind as our family physician, a good worthy soul and thoroughly conversant, as a result of long practice with his job, which was to see people safely into and out of the world, instill common sense into their mothers in dealing with their childish ailments, and to comfort his adult patients by an assumption of knowledge of their cases, which he was far from pretending, in ordinary conversation, to possess. I had been on terms of friendly social intercourse with him ever since my arrival in Cosmopoli, and I thought that I could count upon him to help me deal with my fearful problem with sympathy and tact. This was the one mistake that I have made throughout my trouble, a mistake which has rendered it necessary for me to be prepared for the worst, for scandal, for exposure, and possibly worse. I had not realized and appreciated, though I had perceived unmistakable indications of, the feeling that existed in Cosmopoli with regard to my abduction of Unica and the suicide of Ursula Clayton, which was, in the absence of any possible explanation, the direct result of my action. Dr. Fisher received me with a demeanor which was distant, severe, and almost embarrassed. But though I felt this in my bones, I persuaded myself that my condition of nervous strain led me to exaggerate the peculiar aloofness of his manner.
I'm good.
I hastened to put our interview upon a semi-professional basis. I want to have a word with you, I said, about my wife. Yes? It should have been obvious to me that he was on his guard and had no intention of meeting me halfway. She is very young, much younger indeed than I had any idea of when I married her. And yet, you, as Barrodale's intimate friend, should have known. How old is she? I passed this question by and said, he never spoke to me of his relations with Mrs. Clayton. I only saw the child once before we met accidentally, and fell in love with one another. He shrugged his shoulders slightly and looked away out of the window. I ought to have seen that he did not believe me. I am not satisfied about her health, I went on blindly. I have reason to suspect an endometrititis. Until this has been dealt with surgically, I feel that she ought not to bear children. He remained quite silent, and I proceeded. I do not know whether she would readily submit to examination, but I should like you to make it. You have reason to believe she is pregnant. It was a statement rather than a question. Yes, and if I am right, I think the pregnancy should be avoided, for this time at least. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, where he remained silent for a moment or so, which seemed to me an eternity. And then turning round, but not coming back to his seat, he said, Professor Mackley, I will be quite candid with you. You know, or should know if you do not, that there is a very strong feeling prevalent in this town with regard to your action in taking this young girl away from her mother. A feeling which was greatly exacerbated by the terrible sequel which your action brought about. It is not my intention or inclination to sit in judgment upon you. Your own conscience is probably dealing with the matter, and I do not envy you your reflections. But now you come to me, and in practically so many words you suggest that I should relieve you of immediate consequences and inconvenience by procuring abortion for you. Please understand me once and for all that I absolutely refuse to have any hand in the matter whatever. If your wife consults me, I shall do my utmost to protect her by any means in my power from any attempt of the kind. And before we either of us say anything more, which we might subsequently regret, I think it better that this interview should come to an end. I advise you to forget it, but bear in mind that I shall not. And he moved to the door, which he opened. I can only say that I slunk out. Well, I realized the colossal mistake I had made, and that if anything was to be done, I must depend solely upon myself, and upon Unica. That evening she was lying in my arms on the divan, and by the familiar resource of caressing her amid her wonderful auxiliary hair, I had got her into a condition of luxurious and almost passionate happiness. I opened the subject by saying, Are you very keen to have this baby of yours? Indeed, yes. How can you ask it? Imagine what it will be. Alas, my imagination was only too active, too precise and terrific. I went on. I've been thinking, darling, that we are so intensely happy with one another that it seems a pity to put a stop to it by having a child at once. Would it not be better for both of us if we waited a little? Say a year, during which we can have one another all to ourselves. I am a little jealous of your baby just at present,
We're aware.
though in a year or so... What do you mean? She said, drawing a little away from me and looking at me, her beautiful eyes wide open, the pupils fully dilated. We haven't waited. The baby is here. Well, hardly, I replied, trying to convey an impression that we were merely discussing a possibility of no great importance. These things are easily rectified, avoided. Remember, I am a surgeon, as well as a doctor of medicine and of science. I could put you right without any difficulty or danger, and practically without discomfort or disturbance to yourself. She sprang to her feet. What do you mean? She repeated. Oh, a very simple matter. A drug, perhaps, a very slight operation, and we should be as we were before, and could take our own time about having a child. This one, if it can be called a child yet, is, as it were, an unexpected, a premature accident. She stood looking at me, with an expression of savage loathing and horror. Her breasts heaved tumultuously, her lips parted, not in a smile, tumultuously, but in a ghastly rictus, showing her prominent little canine teeth in an evil, indescribable grin. Her fingers clawed at the joining of her wrapper, which she pulled free from her breast as if to give herself air, and then she said in a voice I had never heard before, a kind of hissing growl, "You propose to me to kill my baby?" "Oh, don't put it like that. I only mean, you mean, oh, you brute, you beast, you devil." "Darling." I sprang up and advanced towards her. She flung out her hands, catching me on the chest with such force that I lost my balance and fell back on the divan. She took a step forward and stood over me. "Don't touch me. Don't come near me. Never again, you murderer." And she fled from the room. I sprang up and followed her, but I was too late. She had gained our bedroom, slammed the door and locked it, and I heard her rush to the door of my dressing room and lock that also. "Darling, listen," I said as loud as I dared, on account of the servants, through the door. "It's all right. I didn't mean it. I promise not to speak of it again. Only come out, or let me in. I must speak to you. You have misunderstood me." I was in agony. After a few minutes, during which I implored her to open the door, I heard her say, still in the raucous voice which had filled me with horror downstairs, "If I open the door for a moment and say something, will you promise me upon your honor as a man not to force your way into the room?" There was no help for it. I promised. Then she opened the door. She had flung off her wrapper and stood, holding the door, clad only in a short crêpe de chine chemise, which had slipped down to her waist on one side, being held on the other by a shoulder ribbon. I'd never seen her look so superb, and she said, hardly above a whisper, "If you force your way in here tonight, I will tear you with my nails. I will bite you. Some way or other, I will kill you. Perhaps tomorrow I may be able to bear to look at you. Now I must think. Leave me alone with my baby." And she closed the door again and locked it. I went downstairs. The whole horror of the situation burst upon me. Unica had reverted to type. She was no longer a girl. She was a cheetah. The animal instinct, fiercely awakened in defense of her young, was aroused to its highest point. I did not attempt to blind myself to the fact. She had become dangerous. I foresaw a condition of things fraught with all the possibilities of appalling tragedy. To protect her unborn offspring, she was capable of anything, even of killing me. For a moment, I wished she would. It would be a happy release for me. But afterwards, regard being had to her parentage, it was impossible to tell how long she would carry her young within her. Would the period of gestation be human or feline? It depended, I felt, upon what was to be born. My scalp contracted with horror at the thought. One thing, and one thing only, was clear to me. I must not allow the monster I anticipated to see the light. I must be no party to the perpetuation of a race of hybrid monsters that might be frightful. And it came to this. I must take precautions that she did not kill me. I must kill her. And I loved her as no man has ever loved a woman before. Utterly, blindly, and even at that supremely awful moment, I desired her beautiful body. I was thirsty to caress, to have her. I tried to sleep on the divan, worn out as I was,
Give me a minute.
but sleep would not come.
It is non-stop. Non-stop this. Give me a minute. Let me collect my thoughts. Plus, I'm running out of time here. I want it to be good. There's a couple cards I was thinking of. It slipped my mind. Oh, that's what it was. The Baron. I'll be right back. see what I can put together here. Red. It's kind of an odd combination for historic. What's this guy? Sacrifice an artifact? No, artifact creature? That's actually not bad. Zombies. I don't know why I said that. Zombie. There we go.
I tossed about all night, sometimes going out into the summer night to cool the fever which raged in every limb. I drank. I thought for a moment again of a hypodermic injection of morphia to dull my tortured senses, to forget for a while, but I feared what Unica might do if she found me insensible in her present mood. No, I must go through with it and keep my brain clear, my presence of mind at its highest pitch. Next day, Unica came down after lunchtime. She recoiled when I would have taken her in my arms. "Sit down," she said, fortunately in her natural low musical voice. "I have something to say to you." I sat down and waited. She paced up and down the room with a curious, soft, patting step. The cheetah was dominant. After a while, she said, "I have thought all night. I know what is in your mind. It's no use to try and reassure me. I have a new instinct, like an animal, a new knowledge, and I can protect myself and my baby. Until it is born, perhaps for always, I will never let you touch me or sleep with me again. I will never be off my guard in your presence. I will take no food which you have had the remotest chance of touching. I will live with you in broad daylight, unless I find it impossible. If I do, I will go away and live upon my annuity where you shall never find me. But you shall have your work to do here, and I don't want to ruin your career." Poor child. She little knew how utterly it was ruined already. I hardly knew myself. It was no use protesting. Her instinct was infallible. For her, I was the enemy, seeking to destroy her and her baby. And it was true. Some weeks have passed since that awful night. As to my own position, I know that my university career is ended. I have only anticipated matters by intimating to the authorities that I retire from the professorship of physiology at the end of this term, and already they are looking for my successor. There are moments when a wave of her old love for me comes over her, and she allows me to caress her lightly, in broad daylight. At the slightest attempt on my part to become demonstratively affectionate, she withdraws herself, as cats do when they are bored with the attention of their human companions. I sleep in my dressing room, where I have added interior bolts to the doors. It is a period of armed strain, but there are times when she allows me to raise one of her arms and plays as of yore with her auxiliary curls. And at these times she is almost off her guard. If my hands wander to her lovely body, she comes to herself and flings me off. But it has given me the clue to the ultimate solution. Time is getting on and I must act. I have a hypodermic filled with aconitine. One day, when she is hypnotized by the only caress she allows me, I shall thrust the needle among the roots of the hair under her arm. It will be instantaneous and undiscoverable. There will be a post-mortem, of course. If the opening of the uterus reveals what I fear, professional etiquette will keep knowledge of the discovery from the world. What I shall do then remains to be seen. I now know that Paul Barrowdale was... I cannot call him a coward, for I know what he bore through the long years, but I know that he inoculated himself with a pure culture of septic pneumonia, and died an apparently natural death. The scientific importance of the facts which have led to these multiple tragedies is too great for them to be utterly lost to future physiologists. I shall deposit this record with Blayre, our registrar, sealed up with instructions that it is not to be opened until 25 years after my death, when a new generation will have forgotten Rex Magley and the scandals which surrounded the closing months of his life. Note: more than 25, nearly 30, in fact, years have elapsed since Rex Magley deposited this manuscript with me. It was obvious when he deposited it that he was suffering from severe mental strain. I knew, of course, of the scandal which was busy with his name and could not but approve of his determination to resign his chair in the university. He told me that he was shortly taking his wife abroad and would look out for some place in the south or west of France, where they had spent their honeymoon, to settle down in. Within a week, returning from a dinner of one of the university societies, where he had ceased to be a welcome companion, he found his wife dead upon the divan in their sitting room. At the inquest, he informed the coroner that he had left her in apparently good health and spirits when he left the house early in the morning.
Okay.
2 days later, he was himself taken seriously ill. A virulent form of septic double pneumonia set in almost at once, and in 36 hours he was dead. All these tragic happenings formed the almost exclusive topic of conversation in the town and university for a few weeks, and then Magley, his wife, and Mrs. Clayton were forgotten. I have pondered deeply whether or not I should destroy this manuscript, and have more than once been on the point of doing so, but at the critical moment it has seemed to me that I have no right to destroy so astounding a record of research work in a most obscure field of knowledge. What I think I shall do will be to seal it up again, to be opened long after my death. One thing alone is fortunate, and that is that neither Paul Barrowdale nor Rex Magley left any ascertainable relations behind them. Barrowdale's fortune reverted under his will to the university. Magley's was escheated to the crown. Christopher Blayre. End of section 10, and end of the Purple Sapphire.
Pretty good. That was a hard one to go off of zombies here. This has nothing to do with that. All I heard was the concealing curtain with the eyeballs. A couple things here and there. Other than that, I didn't really see much. I'll keep going with it though. It does look good. It seems like it'll be fun. That was a good book. Again, I feel like magic was the winner here. It's always a pleasure